As a 32-year-old ghost architect living in a freezing Chicago basement, Clara stared in pure disbelief as her older sister Elena slid the permanent copyright transfer across the cold marble table. Elena wore a custom silk gown, the delicate fabric rustling softly against the expensive leather chairs. She held a crystal glass of imported champagne, looking down with cold, calculating eyes at the scarred, exhausted woman who had secretly designed every award-winning skyscraper currently credited to her name. "The documents have come into force," Elena stated, her voice flat and completely devoid of any sisterly warmth. "Every blueprint, every patent, and every future royalty now belongs entirely to the Vanguard Corporation, under my exclusive legal name." Clara reached for the thick stack of papers with trembling hands, but two heavy corporate security guards immediately stepped forward, blocking her path with their massive frames. For 10 long years, Clara had hidden in the shadows of this very building. She had endured agonizing skin treatments from a childhood accident, sketching brilliant architectural marvels late into the night just to afford basic medical care for her young daughter, Lily. Elena had repeatedly promised to share the massive profits once the firm stabilized. Instead, the beautiful, charismatic sister had just sold Clara's entire life's work for an unimaginable fortune, leaving the actual genius creator with absolutely nothing to her name. The sharp clicking of Elena's high heels echoed loudly across the penthouse floor as she paced, savoring her absolute victory. The brutal betrayal did not end with the architecture firm. Elena casually tossed a second legal folder onto the table, the metallic clasp clinking sharply against the stone surface. Clara instantly recognized the official blue seal of the State Child Welfare Services. A sickening dread pooled in her stomach. "Your health is failing rapidly, Clara, and a damp basement is simply no place to raise a growing child," Elena said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her sparkling champagne. "I have already signed the permanent custody release. Lily is being transferred to the St. Jude orphanage tonight, effectively wiping your existence from her official records." Panic seized Clara's chest, violently squeezing the air from her lungs. She lunged forward, desperate to shred the horrific documents, but the two massive security guards instantly grabbed her frail arms. They twisted her limbs behind her back with brutal, unforgiving force. Her delicate wrists burned in blinding pain. Clara had no legal identity in the cutthroat corporate world, 0 funds in her frozen bank account, and now 0 legal rights to her own flesh and blood. Elena held every single card, ruthlessly wielding their late mother's old guardianship papers like a lethal weapon. The power dynamic was absolute and unbreakable. "You cannot do this to her," Clara screamed, her raw voice tearing violently through the quiet luxury of the massive penthouse. "She is your niece. You stole my work, take it all, but leave my baby alone. Take the trash out," Elena ordered, completely ignoring the heartbreaking plea. She turned her back, gracefully admiring her own flawless reflection in the towering floor-to-ceiling windows. Tomorrow morning, Elena was marrying Julian, the billionaire real estate investor who had fallen madly in love with the brilliant mind behind the futuristic designs. He mistakenly believed that brilliant mind belonged to his beautiful bride. The guards dragged Clara roughly toward the private service elevator. Her heavy winter boots scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floors, her desperate physical struggles completely useless against their overwhelming, trained strength. The heavy brass doors slid shut with a definitive click, permanently cutting off the sickening sight of her sister's smug, triumphant smile. They hauled her down 70 floors in suffocating silence. When they reached the bottom, the guards threw her violently out the back service entrance. Clara hit the freezing, snow-covered pavement of the dark Chicago alleyway with a sickening thud. The icy winter wind cut through her thin, worn sweater instantly, chilling her to the bone. She gasped desperately for air, her knees scraped and bleeding profusely from the harsh impact against the frozen asphalt. Above her, the towering penthouse glowed with warm, golden light, hosting a lavish pre-wedding celebration built entirely on her stolen genius and broken dreams. Clara pushed herself up slowly, her bare hands totally numb against the unforgiving ice. A police cruiser slowly drove past the mouth of the alley, its red and blue lights flashing against the brick walls. Clara froze, instinctively hiding her scarred face behind a frozen, rusting dumpster. It was a wildly controversial decision, but she knew the brutal truth of the justice system. If she ran to the cops reporting a kidnapping right now, looking like a deranged vagrant, She would be arrested for trespassing and declared mentally unstable. That was exactly what Elena had carefully planned. Clara made the agonizing, heart-shattering choice to let the authorities temporarily take Lily into the system for the night, knowing that keeping a clean legal record was the only weapon she had left to fight a billionaire. The profound realization settled deep into her shattered bones, feeling colder than the raging winter storm around her. She had played the good, submissive sister for a decade, enduring the shadows, hoping for mere scraps of familial kindness. That pathetic compliance had just cost her her only child and her entire legacy. Clara gently touched her scarred cheek, the ugly physical reminder of the tragic fire that had originally forced her into hiding all those years ago. The warm tears freezing instantly on her face were no longer born of sorrow or self-pity. They were tears of a terrifying, absolute clarity. She would not just beg to take back her little girl and her architectural blueprints. She would completely tear down Elena's stolen, glamorous empire, brick by stolen brick. And she would start by utterly destroying the billionaire groom who funded the entire illusion. The weak, hidden ghost was dead. The architect of their ruin had just been born. Frostbite was already claiming her unprotected fingers when Clara dragged herself into the blinding fluorescent glare of a 24-hour Walgreens. The harsh overhead lighting mercilessly illuminated the blood drying on her torn clothes and the grotesque burn scars covering the left side of her face. The overnight cashier stared in silent horror, but Clara ignored the piercing judgment. She desperately needed the biting warmth of the store heating vents. Huddled in a secluded aisle next to the generic greeting cards, she ruthlessly assessed her grim situation. The freezing Chicago winter raged fiercely outside the glass doors, the howling wind rattling the heavy metal frames. Elena had violently stripped her of every legal right, banking on the freezing temperatures to finish the job. But her beautiful, greedy sister had made one catastrophic miscalculation in her flawless plan. Elena arrogantly assumed the raw, original design files were stored entirely on the Vanguard Corporation internal network. She was completely, fatally wrong. The true foundation of the billion-dollar architectural empire was currently sewn securely into the frayed inner lining of Clara's cheap winter coat. It was a highly encrypted, military-grade flash drive containing the undisputed digital footprint of every single project Elena had ever stolen. As the brutal sun finally rose over the icy metropolitan skyline, Clara walked 3 agonizing miles to the Central Public Library. Her frozen joints screamed in agony with every single step, the raw skin on her knees bleeding fresh crimson into her torn jeans. Raw, burning hatred fueled her fragile body, pushing her far past the limits of normal human endurance. She used a public computer terminal to send one highly classified, heavily encrypted email to the only man powerful enough to challenge her sister's new billionaire husband. Marcus Thorne was Julian's most ruthless competitor in the luxury real estate development sector. He was an apex corporate predator known for dismantling rival empires with terrifying, surgical precision. Less than 2 hours after Clara hit the send button, a heavily armored black SUV silently pulled up to the snowy curb outside the Grand Library entrance. 2 men in immaculate wool suits escorted the shivering, scarred woman into the plush, heated leather interior. The heavy doors slammed shut, immediately blocking out the howling wind. Marcus sat in the deep shadows of the back seat, nursing a heavy crystal glass of dark amber whiskey. He looked at the wretched, bleeding woman with a mixture of profound disgust and sharp, calculating curiosity. "You claim to possess the structural vulnerability for the new Vanguard spire," Marcus stated, his deep voice vibrating with absolute authority over the quiet hum of the powerful engine. "My engineers have studied Elena's blueprints for 6 straight months and found absolutely nothing but architectural perfection." Clara did not flinch under his predatory gaze. She pulled the tiny metal drive from her coat, the object clicking sharply against the polished wood trim of the luxury vehicle console. "That is because Elena does not understand the very building she claims to have designed," Clara replied, her voice steady and chillingly calm despite her violent shivering. "I deliberately engineered a microscopic load-bearing flaw in the foundational support columns. If Julian pours the concrete tomorrow morning, the entire billion-dollar project will be condemned within a single year." Marcus leaned forward abruptly, the solid ice cubes clinking loudly against his crystal glass. The thick power dynamic inside the moving vehicle shifted instantly. Clara was no longer a desperate beggar freezing in the streets. She was the supreme architect holding the ultimate detonator to his rival's legacy. She outlined her strict, non-negotiable terms with ruthless efficiency. She did not want a massive cash payout. She demanded immediate, untraceable access to an elite, underground plastic surgery clinic. She needed a completely new, ironclad legal identity constructed from thin air. And most importantly, she required a massive financial trust established for a highly specific, legally binding purpose. I want your shell corporation to legally adopt my daughter from the St. Jude orphanage by tomorrow afternoon, Clara demanded, stating the highly controversial term without a single tremor in her battered voice. Transfer her to a private boarding school in Switzerland under a fake surname. Completely sever my biological connection to her on all official state records. It was a brutally cold decision, sacrificing her sacred legal motherhood to ensure Lily was forever protected from Elena's toxic, far-reaching influence. She was permanently erasing herself from her child's life to save it. Marcus raised an elegant eyebrow at the sheer ruthlessness of the devastated mother, a dark, dangerous smile slowly spreading across his face. He recognized a fellow apex predator when he saw one. He agreed to fund the entire impossible resurrection without another word. The heavy SUV immediately changed directions, speeding aggressively toward a private medical facility hidden deep within the affluent city suburbs. Upon arrival, Clara was swiftly stripped of her bloodied rags and placed onto a sterile stainless steel operating table. The harsh surgical lights snapped on simultaneously, blindingly bright against the stark white ceiling. An elite team of reconstructive surgeons surrounded her, examining the extensive burn tissue and broken bones with cold, clinical precision. The sterile smell of heavy antiseptics burned her lungs, but it smelled incredibly like sweet freedom. The lead surgeon picked up a sleek digital tablet, preparing to map out the complex facial reconstruction matrix. "We can give you a completely fresh canvas," the doctor offered, his latex gloves snapping loudly in the painfully quiet room. "A subtle, beautiful bone structure that will easily blend into high society without drawing any unwanted suspicion. We can erase every trace of your past trauma." Clara stared blankly up at the blinding lights, the vivid image of her sister's smug, triumphant smile burning violently in her mind. The pathetic ghost who hid in the basement was truly dead. She rejected the doctor's safe, generic suggestion with absolute, terrifying finality. Clara reached out, her trembling, bruised fingers firmly tapping the glowing screen of the advanced medical tablet. She swiped past the anonymous reference models and pulled up a high-resolution magazine cover featuring Elena's flawless, universally admired face. It was the exact face of the woman who had stolen her mind, her precious child, and her entire existence. "Do not make me blend in," Clara commanded, the heavy anesthesia slowly creeping into her exhausted veins and numbing the agonizing pain. "I want you to sculpt my jaw, my nose, and my eyes to perfectly match this exact photograph. Make me her flawless, undeniable twin." As the heavy, suffocating darkness of the medication finally pulled her under, Clara smiled a chilling, bloodied smile. The ultimate revenge was not just destroying Elena's massive empire. It was replacing the queen entirely. 6 months of agonizing bone reconstruction had finally forged the ultimate weapon against the Vanguard Empire. Clara stood perfectly still in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirrors inside her heavily guarded Manhattan penthouse, staring into the eyes of her absolute worst enemy. The elite surgical team had performed an undeniable miracle, molding her shattered jawline, cheekbones, and nose to perfectly mirror the woman who had mercilessly destroyed her life. But while Elena always radiated a desperate, needy warmth to captivate her wealthy investors, Clara now possessed the cold, untouchable aura of an apex predator. Marcus Thorne had meticulously constructed her impenetrable new identity over the long, painful winter. She was no longer a pathetic, scarred ghost hiding in a freezing basement. She was Victoria Croft, a ruthlessly private venture capitalist backed by a bottomless European trust fund. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel hummed with the arrogant chatter of the city elite, hosting the annual charity gala for the Vanguard Corporation. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, golden light over the sea of custom tuxedos and priceless diamond necklaces. Clara stepped elegantly out of her armored town car, the heavy black silk of her backless gown flowing like dark water against the pristine red carpet. She bypassed the aggressively flashing cameras of the paparazzi, her security detail smoothly clearing a wide path through the crowded lobby. Tonight was the official celebration of the Vanguard Spire groundbreaking, the exact project Elena had stolen to cement her fraudulent legacy. Clara glided into the main hall, her predatory gaze instantly locking onto her primary target standing near the center ice sculpture. Julian stood tall and aggressively confident, holding a glass of aged bourbon while holding court with several powerful Wall Street bankers. He was the billionaire visionary funding the massive skyscraper, completely blind to the fact that his beautiful new wife was an absolute intellectual fraud. Clara positioned herself deliberately across the room, perfectly illuminated by the soft glow of a massive holographic projection of the spire. She waited with terrifying patience until the precise moment Julian casually glanced over the rim of his crystal glass. The profound shock hit the billionaire with the brutal force of a physical blow. His broad shoulders instantly tensed, and the casual, arrogant smile completely vanished from his handsome face as he stared at the impossible woman standing by the exhibit. Clara looked exactly like his wife, possessing the same flawless bone structure and piercing eyes, but the dark, commanding energy she projected was entirely foreign. Intoxicated by pure confusion, Julian immediately excused himself from the wealthy bankers and closed the distance between them. He approached cautiously, his sharp eyes scanning her face for any hidden seams or elaborate makeup tricks. Clara did not shrink away or lower her gaze like the old basement architect would have done. She held her ground effortlessly, offering a slow, knowing smile that made the powerful billionaire genuinely falter in his expensive leather shoes. "I must admit, the resemblance is absolutely uncanny," Julian finally murmured, his deep voice thick with undeniable suspicion and dark fascination. "For a brief moment, I genuinely thought my wife had slipped away from her press interview to change into a much more dangerous dress." "Everyone has a mirror image somewhere in the world," Clara replied smoothly, her voice purposely calibrated to sound slightly deeper and far more authoritative than her sister. "Victoria Croft, I am representing a private consortium deeply interested in the structural integrity of your upcoming project." Julian visibly relaxed at the mention of business, leaning closer to the glowing blue hologram of the massive tower. He proudly began reciting the exact marketing pitch Elena had undoubtedly memorized from Clara's stolen personal journals. He boasted about the revolutionary load-bearing columns and the brilliant aesthetic choices his wife had supposedly pioneered. Clara listened with cold, silent amusement, letting him dig his own intellectual grave. When he finally paused to take a confident sip of his bourbon, Clara struck with surgical, devastating precision. "It is a beautiful illusion," Clara stated calmly, gracefully tracing her manicured finger along the projected base of the holographic tower. "However, the foundational stress distribution along the southern axis is mathematically flawed. If you pour the concrete tomorrow morning using these current schematics, the shear wind shear at the 60th floor will cause microscopic fractures in the primary support beams within exactly 10 months. The heavy crystal glass nearly slipped from Julian's suddenly numb fingers. His sharp executive mind instantly recognized the brutal, undeniable truth hidden within her highly technical assessment. Elena had continuously struggled to explain the complex math behind her own supposed designs, always deflecting his direct structural questions with charming smiles and vague artistic philosophies. But this mysterious, striking woman was casually dismantling the billion-dollar engineering core of his flagship project while sipping sparkling water. The absolute power dynamic in the crowded ballroom shifted violently, completely ripping the control away from the confident billionaire. "My lead engineers have reviewed these blueprints 100 times, Julian countered defensively, though a dark seed of terrifying doubt had clearly taken root in his eyes. "My wife is an architectural genius. Your engineers are paid to agree with your checkbook, and your wife is an exceptional marketer," Clara countered ruthlessly, stepping uncomfortably close to his personal space. "Genius is rarely found in the spotlight. It usually hides in the dark, doing the agonizing work while the beautiful people take the credit. Check the math yourself before you bury $1 billion in the dirt tomorrow." Clara did not wait for a response or a defense. She seamlessly turned her back on the stunned billionaire, walking away with absolute confidence. She paused on the sweeping marble staircase leading to the upper balcony, glancing back down at the crowded ballroom. Elena had finally finished her hollow press interview, smiling brightly as she hurried toward her powerful husband, but Julian did not even look at his beautiful bride. His face was pale, and he was already pulling out his phone, frantically dialing his lead structural engineer. Clara smiled, pulling her dark silk shawl over her shoulders. The invincible foundation of their fraudulent empire was officially cracking. Panic was an ugly, unfamiliar emotion on Elena's perfectly sculpted face as she stared at the glowing tablet. The breathless anchor on Bloomberg television was already reporting the shocking news to the entire financial world. Julian had officially ordered an indefinite halt on the Vanguard Spire construction just hours before the massive concrete pour was scheduled to begin. The corporate stock for their joint real estate venture was currently plummeting, shedding millions of dollars in value with every passing minute. Elena paced furiously across the sprawling penthouse, her silk robe trailing over the expensive Persian rugs as she desperately dialed her lead structural engineer for the 10th time. He had officially resigned just 20 minutes ago, citing an unsolvable mathematical flaw in the southern axis of the foundation. Julian sat silently at the dark mahogany dining table, swirling a glass of neat whiskey while watching his beautiful wife unravel. He had explicitly demanded that she redraw the complex load-bearing schematics by midnight to save the multi-billion-dollar project. Elena was drowning in a suffocating wave of pure terror because she did not even understand the basic geometry of the blueprints she claimed to have designed. For a decade, she had simply stolen Clara's brilliant, completed notebooks from the freezing basement, never bothering to learn the actual science behind the breathtaking art. "I just need a quiet workspace to concentrate," Elena lied smoothly, forcing a tight, reassuring smile onto her pale lips as she approached her husband. "The engineers are simply overreacting to a minor aesthetic calculation." "It is not an aesthetic issue, Elena," Julian replied coldly, his sharp gaze piercing right through her fragile facade. "It is a catastrophic structural failure. Victoria Croft identified the flaw from across the room at the gala last night. She represents the exact European consortium we desperately need to secure the secondary funding." The unfamiliar name hit Elena like a physical slap across the face. She had spent the entire morning screaming at her legal team, trying to track down her pathetic sister, terrified that Clara had somehow leaked the stolen documents. But Clara was completely erased from the grid, and this mysterious venture capitalist was suddenly whispering in her husband's ear. Julian placed his crystal glass heavily onto the table, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. He delivered his ultimate, non-negotiable ultimatum with ruthless corporate efficiency. He had already arranged an emergency meeting with Victoria Croft. Elena was ordered to swallow her massive pride and collaborate directly with the brilliant European investor to fix the broken schematics before the massive public relations scandal destroyed them both. Less than 2 hours later, Elena walked stiffly into the private conference room of the downtown Vanguard headquarters. Her stomach churned violently with a sickening mixture of pure anxiety and bitter resentment. She expected to meet a seasoned, arrogant Wall Street veteran. Instead, she completely froze in the heavy glass doorway, the leather portfolio slipping from her trembling fingers and crashing loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. The woman standing calmly by the floor-to-ceiling window possessed the exact same high cheekbones, the same piercing eyes, and the same flawless jawline. "Close your mouth, Elena," Clara commanded softly, her voice dripping with an icy, lethal authority that made the older sister instinctively take a step back. "You look like a frightened amateur, and we have a billion-dollar disaster to discuss." Elena gripped the edge of the heavy oak table, her mind violently spinning as she stared at the impossible phantom. The woman wore a sharply tailored designer suit and exuded an aura of absolute terrifying control. This was not the broken, scarred ghost she had tossed into the freezing alley. "Who are you?" Elena whispered frantically, her carefully crafted elegant persona shattering into a million pathetic pieces. "I am the architect of your ruin," Clara replied, leaning in close enough for Elena to smell her expensive perfume. "You stole my life's work, but you were far too stupid to steal the actual intellect required to sustain it. Julian knows, you are a total fraud." Clara gracefully slid a heavy legal document across the table, demanding complete, undisputed creative and structural control over the Vanguard Spire. Furthermore, the contract explicitly stated that Elena would publicly act as Victoria Croft's subordinate assistant for the remainder of the massive project. It was the ultimate, soul-crushing humiliation for a woman whose entire existence revolved around aggressive public adoration and fake superiority. If Elena refused to sign the degrading contract, Clara promised to walk out the door, letting the entire skyscraper project collapse into absolute bankruptcy by morning. Julian would instantly divorce his useless, lying bride, and the ruthless corporate media would completely devour her fake legacy. "Sign the paper, assistant," Clara ordered smoothly, tapping a heavy gold pen against the dotted line. "Or I will call Julian right now and explain exactly why you cannot do basic high school geometry." Trembling with helpless, blinding rage and suffocating humiliation, Elena slowly picked up the heavy gold pen. She signed her own prestigious career away to a stranger wearing her face, officially realizing the brutal siege had only just begun. The piercing shriek of a heavy industrial drill echoed across the massive Vanguard Spire construction site. The biting Chicago wind whipped brutally off the gray lake, snapping the neon orange safety flags attached to the exposed steel girders. Clara stepped out of the temporary site elevator onto the 40th floor, the heavy soles of her designer boots crunching loudly against the raw concrete. She wore a pristine white hard hat and a fiercely tailored wool trench coat, commanding the chaotic environment with terrifying, effortless authority. Trailing pathetically 3 steps behind her was the billionaire bride. Elena stumbled awkwardly over thick electrical cables in her expensive high heels, desperately clutching a heavy roll of modified blueprints to her chest like a humiliated intern. For 2 agonizing weeks, Clara had ruthlessly paraded her older sister across every single high-level board meeting and dusty construction zone, forcing Elena to silently take dictation and fetch bottled water in front of her own confused employees. Julian stood near the edge of the exposed floor, surrounded by a dozen anxious structural foremen. He was aggressively demanding answers about the revised timeline. When he saw Clara approaching, the deep, frustrated scowl instantly vanished from his handsome face. He practically shoved his lead foreman aside to greet the brilliant European venture capitalist. "Victoria," Julian said warmly, his dark eyes lighting up with genuine, profound admiration. "The new load-bearing schematics you submitted yesterday are nothing short of revolutionary. You completely solved the wind shear dilemma on the upper residential levels. It was a simple matter of redistributing the kinetic stress along the central elevator core," Clara replied smoothly, stepping dangerously close to the exposed edge of the towering building. The dizzying, panoramic view of the city did not make her flinch. A fundamental principle of modern physics. Any competent architect would have recognized the original fatal error instantly. Clara let the heavy silence hang in the freezing air, the unspoken insult landing directly on Elena. The beautiful sister flinched visibly, her knuckles turning bone-white as she gripped the thick blueprints. Julian did not even bother to look at his wife. He was completely mesmerized by the sharp, undeniable intellect radiating from the mysterious woman wearing his wife's exact face. The stark contrast between the 2 identical women was brutally obvious. Elena was a fragile, empty shell of marketing buzzwords, while Victoria Croft possessed the intoxicating, dangerous power of a true visionary. Desperate to reclaim a tiny fraction of her shattered dignity in front of her powerful husband, Elena forced a strained, artificial smile and nervously stepped forward. "I always believed the aesthetic synergy of the southern glass panels would naturally absorb the excess vibration," Elena interjected, using the hollow corporate jargon she had successfully parroted for a decade. The entire group of hardened construction foremen fell totally silent, staring at the billionaire bride with barely concealed professional pity. Julian closed his eyes for a brief second, a deep muscle feathering in his clenched jaw. The profound embarrassment he felt for his incompetent wife was physically palpable. "Glass does not absorb kinetic vibration, Elena. It shatters into a million lethal pieces," Clara stated coldly, her voice cutting through the howling wind like a jagged knife. "Please unroll the structural cross-section for your husband. I need to show him the revised titanium anchoring points." Elena stood completely frozen, a hot flush of absolute humiliation burning her perfect cheeks. She awkwardly fumbled with the heavy rubber-banded architectural tubes, her manicured nails slipping uselessly against the thick paper. She was the wealthy owner of the Vanguard Corporation, but right now, she was reduced to a bumbling, useless servant. Clara sighed dramatically, shaking her head with pure, unfiltered condescension. "Never mind, assistant," Clara ordered sharply, snatching the tubes right out of Elena's trembling hands. "Go downstairs to the main site trailer and fetch the updated electrical permits. Try not to lose them on the way." The raw, undeniable power dynamic shifted with sickening finality. Elena looked desperately at Julian, silently begging her husband to defend her honor, to reprimand this arrogant foreign investor for the public disrespect. But Julian simply looked away, his cold silence officially validating the brutal hierarchy. He was actively choosing the brilliant mind over the empty, lying vessel. Tears of helpless rage stung Elena's eyes as she turned around, her expensive heels clicking a humiliating retreat toward the temporary elevator. Clara smoothly unrolled the massive blueprint across a flat stack of drywall, gesturing for Julian to lean in closer. Their shoulders brushed deliberately in the freezing wind. It was a highly calculated, deeply controversial maneuver. Clara was actively using the intoxicating allure of her stolen genius to seduce her sister's husband. She was crossing a dark, murky moral line, turning the massive construction site into a psychological war zone. "You have an extraordinary mind, Victoria," Julian murmured softly, his attention completely abandoning the complex architectural drawings to study the flawless, commanding lines of her face. "I have never met a woman who understands my vision so perfectly." "I understand exactly what you are building, Julian," Clara replied, her dark eyes locking onto his with terrifying, unseen intent. "And I know exactly what it takes to tear it all down." Julian misinterpreted the lethal threat as a fierce corporate challenge, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his lips. The howling wind masked the sound of the descending elevator, officially carrying the ruined sister away from her own empire. "I am hosting a private dinner at my estate tonight to discuss the international expansion," Julian offered, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "I would like you to attend." "Alone. Elena needs to stay behind and review the basic math she clearly lacks." Clara offered a slow, chilling smile as she accepted the highly exclusive invitation. The billionaire was willingly opening the heavy gates to his private sanctuary, completely unaware he was inviting the ultimate ghost inside to burn his world to ashes. The sprawling estate was a breathtaking monument to absolute wealth and completely stolen genius. Clara stepped out of her chauffeured car into the crisp evening air, her dark velvet dress absorbing the soft, golden light spilling from the massive front windows. Julian stood in the grand foyer, wearing a relaxed cashmere sweater. He looked dangerously captivated by his brilliant guest. Clara smiled her cold, calculated smile, stepping over the threshold and officially invading the most private, sacred sanctuary of her older sister. The house looked like a high-end magazine spread, but felt entirely soulless. It was a perfect, empty museum. Julian led Clara into the cavernous living room, pouring 2 glasses of incredibly rare vintage red wine. The fireplace roared, casting dancing shadows against towering bookshelves. Clara accepted the glass, her fingers deliberately brushing his for a fraction of a second longer than socially acceptable. Julian did not pull away. His dark eyes remained intensely focused on her face, searching for the brilliant, ruthless spark he had witnessed at the construction site earlier that afternoon. "My wife usually fills this house with endless, loud parties," Julian murmured softly, taking a slow sip of his wine as he gestured around the quiet, empty room. "She hates the silence. She says it makes her feel terribly anxious. But tonight, listening to the quiet with you, it feels completely different. It feels like absolute clarity. Silence is only terrifying if your mind is completely empty, Julian," Clara replied smoothly, her deep voice vibrating with dark, undeniable truth. "People who steal their identities from others constantly need loud noises to drown out the pathetic, screaming imposter hiding inside their own heads." The brutal philosophical observation struck Julian with profound force. He stared at her, completely mesmerized by the lethal combination of her flawless physical beauty and her razor-sharp intellect. Clara asked for a brief, private tour of the estate, feigning a polite, professional interest in the structural layout of his massive home. Julian eagerly agreed, completely unaware he was guiding a highly trained predator straight into the heart of the nest. He proudly showed her the sprawling indoor pool, the massive home theater, and finally, the crown jewel of Elena's fake persona, her private architectural studio. Julian bypassed the security keypad on the heavy oak door, letting Clara enter the pristine room. It was a massive, beautiful workspace flooded with moonlight from the overhead skylights. Stacks of expensive, blank drafting paper sat completely undisturbed on the sleek glass tables. The entire room was a pathetic, expensive theater set. Elena had never drawn a single line in this room. Clara slowly walked along the walls, her eyes locking onto a massive, custom-framed blueprint hanging directly behind the main desk. It was the original, award-winning schematic for the Chicago Art Pavilion. It was the very first project Elena had ever stolen from the freezing basement. Clara felt a raw, violent surge of pure hatred twisting deep inside her chest, but her beautiful face remained completely impassive. She elegantly set her crystal wine glass down on the immaculate desk. "It is a breathtaking early work," Julian noted proudly, standing close behind her shoulder. "Elena sketched that entirely by hand during our first year together. She used to stay up all night working on those intricate archways." "It is quite beautiful," Clara agreed softly, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a thick, red drafting pen resting in a silver cup on the desk. "But the structural tension on the eastern arch is slightly imbalanced. May I?" Julian nodded, completely entranced by her absolute confidence. Clara picked up the red pen. She did not just make a random mark. With precise, fluid, and terrifyingly familiar strokes, she drew a highly specific, complex mathematical correction directly onto the pristine, expensive glass protecting the framed blueprint. But she did not stop at the geometry. In the bottom right corner, she swiftly sketched a tiny distinct symbol, a fractured triangle inside a perfect circle. It was her old, secret signature. It was the exact watermark she used to hide in the margins of all her original basement sketches before Elena ruthlessly scrubbed them clean for corporate submission. Julian frowned slightly, not understanding the profound significance of the tiny symbol. To him, it was just a brilliant architect making a casual, artistic correction. But Clara knew the absolute truth. When Elena eventually returned to this fake sanctuary, that specific red symbol would hit her like a violent, psychological earthquake. It was a brutal, undeniable message from beyond the grave. "You see the invisible flaws in absolutely everything, Victoria," Julian whispered, stepping so close that Clara could feel the warm heat radiating from his chest. His voice was thick with heavy, undeniable desire. He reached out, his hand gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair away from her face. "It makes me wonder what terrifying flaws you see when you look at my marriage." Clara did not step away from his intimate touch. She leaned into the dangerous, highly controversial dynamic, fully weaponizing her stolen beauty to completely shatter the billionaire's loyalty to his wife. She tilted her chin up, looking deeply into his eyes with cold, calculated intent. "I see a powerful king who is starving to death while eating at a banquet of beautiful lies," Clara whispered, her voice a dark, seductive poison dripping directly into his ear. "You married a stunning shadow, Julian, but shadows cannot keep you warm when the actual fire finally burns everything to the ground." Before Julian could respond, the heavy sound of a luxury sports car pulling into the driveway shattered the intimate silence. The front doors slammed shut downstairs, followed by the frantic clicking of Elena's heels rushing across the marble foyer. The ruined, humiliated wife had finally returned to her empty castle. Clara slowly stepped back from the billionaire, a dark, triumphant smile playing on her lips. The trap was perfectly set, the ghost was officially in the machine, and the psychological slaughter was about to begin. The heavy oak door swung open violently, revealing Elena standing breathless and trembling in the dim hallway. Her designer coat was completely soaked from the freezing rain, her perfectly styled hair plastered against her pale cheeks. She stared in absolute, paralyzing horror at the intimate scene unfolding inside her private architectural sanctuary. Her powerful billionaire husband was holding a crystal glass of expensive red wine, standing uncomfortably close to the mysterious venture capitalist who had systematically destroyed her entire career in a single afternoon. Clara slowly turned to face her ruined older sister, her dark eyes flashing with cold, calculated amusement. "What is she doing in my house, Julian?" Elena demanded, her voice shrill and echoing wildly against the high ceiling. "This is my private workspace. No one is allowed in here without my explicit permission. I demand that she leaves this estate immediately. Do not raise your voice in my home, Elena," Julian commanded coldly, his deep voice carrying a terrifying, unfamiliar edge. "Victoria is our lead investor. We were discussing the catastrophic foundational flaws you completely failed to recognize. She possesses the structural brilliance that you clearly lack." The brutal, public defense of the enemy hit Elena like a physical blow to the stomach. She stumbled forward, her wet high heels slipping slightly against the polished hardwood floor. Desperate to reclaim her shattered territory, Elena aggressively marched toward her pristine glass desk, intending to physically block Clara from her stolen blueprints. But as she rounded the heavy oak table, her frantic eyes locked onto the massive, custom-framed schematic hanging proudly on the wall. The bold, red drafting ink slashed across the protective glass instantly commanded her attention. Elena stopped dead in her tracks, the breath completely leaving her lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. She recognized the complex mathematical correction immediately, but that was not what made her blood run absolutely cold. Resting quietly in the bottom right corner of the expensive glass was a tiny, unmistakable symbol. It was a fractured triangle resting perfectly inside a solid circle. It was the exact, secret signature her dead sister Clara used to hide on every single original sketch. The heavy, suffocating weight of absolute terror crushed Elena's chest as she stared at the undeniable ghost staring back at her. "Where did you see that symbol?" Elena whispered frantically, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the desk to remain standing. "Who told you to draw that specific shape? That does not belong to you." Clara offered a perfectly blank, professionally confused expression, seamlessly sliding into her calculated role. She casually picked up her wine glass, taking a slow, elegant sip before answering the terrified woman. Her absolute calm only magnified Elena's spiraling panic. "It is a standard European notation for kinetic stress distribution." Clara lied smoothly, her deep voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I learned it during my graduate studies in Switzerland." "Why are you shaking, assistant? Does basic geometry frighten you that much?" "You are lying," Elena screamed, completely losing her carefully crafted elegant facade. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at the red ink, her eyes wide with genuine madness. "That is not a standard notation. That is a personal signature. Someone from my past sent you here to ruin me. You are trying to drive me insane." Julian slammed his crystal wine glass down onto the glass table, the sharp, explosive sound instantly silencing his hysterical wife. He looked at Elena with pure, unfiltered disgust, completely exhausted by her pathetic, erratic behavior. He saw a brilliant, composed European investor on one side of the room, and a shrieking, incompetent fraud on the other. The profound contrast officially shattered whatever lingering affection he still held for his beautiful bride. He delivered his ultimate, devastating verdict with ruthless corporate precision. "You are completely unhinged, Elena, and I am exhausted by your endless incompetence," Julian stated coldly, buttoning his cashmere sweater with terrifying finality. "Since you clearly cannot handle the mental pressure of your own supposed designs, I am officially reassigning this entire workspace. Victoria will use this studio as her private office while she fixes your billion-dollar mistakes." The sheer, unprecedented cruelty of the decree echoed through the massive room. Julian was casually evicting Elena from her own sacred sanctuary, giving the ultimate symbol of her fake legacy to a complete stranger. Elena opened her mouth to argue, but the suffocating panic rising in her throat choked the pathetic words away. Clara smiled her dark, victorious smile, stepping gracefully around the heavy desk. She reached out and gently plucked the thick, red drafting pen right out of Elena's trembling fingers, silently claiming absolute ownership of the stolen empire. "Pack your cosmetic bags." "Assistant," Clara ordered softly, leaning in close enough for Elena to smell the vintage red wine on her breath. "And please close the door on your way out. The actual architect needs absolute silence to work." Julian did not even look back as he escorted the brilliant venture capitalist toward the leather seating area, leaving his ruined wife standing alone in the dark corner. Humiliated, terrified, and violently questioning her own sanity, Elena stumbled blindly out of the room. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, officially locking her out of her own life. She leaned heavily against the cold hallway wall, desperately pulling out her diamond-encrusted phone. Her trembling fingers punched in the private number for the State Child Welfare Services. If Clara was somehow reaching out from the grave to destroy her, Elena desperately needed to confirm the only leverage she still possessed. The phone rang agonizingly long, before a tired administrative worker finally answered the late-night call. Elena frantically demanded an immediate status update on her young niece, Lily, needing the sick reassurance that the child was still locked safely away in the brutal system. The indifferent voice on the other end of the line delivered the ultimate, paralyzing nightmare. Lily was gone, permanently adopted by an anonymous corporate trust just hours ago, and all official records had been completely erased from the government database. The ghost had already taken everything. 72 agonizing hours had passed since Julian officially banished Elena from their marital bedroom, forcing the disgraced bride to sleep in a small sterile guest suite at the far end of the long hallway. The psychological torture was absolutely relentless. Every single morning, Elena had to listen to the bright, confident laughter of Victoria Croft echoing from the grand architectural studio down the corridor. Her powerful husband was completely intoxicated by the mysterious European investor, spending every waking moment locked inside the room with her, deliberately ignoring his desperate, frantic wife. Elena was rapidly unraveling, her flawless public mask cracking under the crushing weight of pure, suffocating paranoia. She had completely stopped eating, her manicured fingernails bitten down to the quick as she obsessively paced the expensive Persian rugs. When Elena finally tried to book a private flight to Paris to escape the humiliating nightmare, the elite concierge service politely informed her that Julian had permanently frozen all of her platinum credit cards. She was a billionaire on paper, but in absolute reality, she was entirely penniless and completely trapped. Driven entirely by sheer, animalistic desperation, Elena crept into her massive walk-in closet under the cover of darkness. She ruthlessly ripped a heavy diamond necklace from its velvet display box, shoving the priceless jewelry deep into her designer coat. The elegant queen of the Chicago social scene was officially reduced to a common, desperate thief stealing from her own husband to fund her frantic survival. The heavy rain battered the concrete roof of the grim, underground parking structure on the dangerous south side of the city. Elena shuddered violently, clutching her damp coat tightly against the freezing wind. The suffocating smell of stale cigarette smoke and motor oil made her physically nauseous. A rusted sedan slowly pulled out of the thick shadows, its dim headlights illuminating the terrified woman. A disgraced former police detective named Vance stepped out of the vehicle, his worn leather jacket a stark contrast to her ruined silk blouse. He was a ruthless, unethical private investigator known for doing the dirty, illegal jobs the wealthy elite desperately needed to keep hidden from the public eye. Elena handed him a thick envelope containing the pawned cash from her stolen diamonds. She demanded a complete, exhaustive background check on Victoria Croft, screaming at the grizzled investigator to hack into the private European banking servers if necessary. She needed solid, undeniable proof that the brilliant venture capitalist was a corporate spy, a dangerous fraud sent to destroy her marriage. Vance silently counted the massive stack of cash, his greedy eyes flashing with dark amusement as he watched the famous, beautiful architect completely lose her fragile mind in a dirty parking garage. However, Elena was completely unaware that she was playing a rigged game against an apex predator. Less than an hour after the sleazy investigator left the damp garage, a heavily armored black luxury vehicle seamlessly intercepted his rusted sedan on a deserted industrial road. Marcus Thorne stepped out into the freezing rain, holding a sleek silver briefcase. The ruthless corporate titan did not threaten the disgraced detective with violence. Instead, Marcus casually opened the heavy briefcase, revealing a massive fortune in untraceable cash. He instructed Vance to feed the desperate, terrified wife exactly what the trap required her to see. The brilliant snare was flawlessly executed without spilling a single drop of blood. 2 days later, Vance demanded an urgent, secret meeting at a crowded downtown coffee shop. Elena arrived wearing a heavy silk scarf and oversized dark sunglasses, terrified of being recognized by the ruthless corporate paparazzi. She slid into the secluded corner booth, her hands trembling violently as the investigator slid a thick manila folder across the sticky wooden table. Vance leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper, perfectly delivering the fabricated lie Marcus had carefully purchased. Victoria Croft is a complete ghost, Vance lied smoothly, tapping the heavy file with a stained finger. Her European trust fund was established less than a year ago through a maze of anonymous shell companies. But I managed to track the initial wire transfer back to a local real estate acquisition firm here in Chicago. The mysterious investor recently purchased a heavily abandoned, condemned apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of the city. Why would a billionaire venture capitalist buy a worthless rotting basement? The air instantly vanished from Elena's lungs. She snatched the thick file, her panicked eyes scanning the grainy surveillance photographs attached to the confidential report. The world violently tilted on its axis. She instantly recognized the crumbling brick facade, the rusted iron bars covering the ground-level windows, and the heavy metal door leading down into the dark earth. It was the exact basement where she had kept Clara hidden for a decade. It was the freezing, miserable dungeon where she had stolen every single brilliant blueprint that built her massive empire. The terrifying truth hit Elena like a runaway freight train. Victoria Croft was not a corporate spy sent by a rival firm. Victoria Croft knew exactly where the Vanguard Empire was truly born. The ghost had found the original graveyard. "I need you to drive me there right now," Elena commanded frantically, her voice cracking with absolute, blinding panic. "She is looking for the original drafting journals I left behind. If she finds the raw sketches in that basement, my husband will send me to federal prison for corporate fraud." Elena did not wait for the investigator to argue. She practically ran out of the crowded coffee shop, her mind completely consumed by the desperate, frantic need to destroy the remaining evidence. She was willingly walking straight into the dark, waiting jaws of the ultimate trap, driven entirely by her own sickening guilt and suffocating paranoia. Clara had not just taken her husband and her empire. Clara had successfully manipulated her older sister into digging her own grave. The rusted iron hinges of the heavy basement door screamed in agonizing protest as Elena violently shoved it open. The freezing, damp air immediately assaulted her lungs, carrying the sickening, familiar scent of rotting wood, leaking pipes, and old drafting paper. The condemned apartment complex was completely pitch black, the electrical grid having been permanently severed months ago. Elena activated the harsh, blinding flashlight on her diamond-encrusted phone, her trembling beam of light cutting through the thick, swirling dust. She stumbled blindly down the cracked concrete stairs, her expensive high heels snapping instantly against the uneven, dangerous steps. She did not care about the ruined designer shoes or the filthy water soaking into her pristine silk trousers. She was a desperate, hunted animal, driven entirely by the suffocating terror of losing her stolen empire and facing public, humiliating ruin. Elena aggressively swept the bright beam across the miserable, windowless room. The rusted folding cot still sat in the dark corner, surrounded by towering stacks of decaying cardboard boxes. She threw her phone onto the filthy mattress and began violently tearing the fragile boxes apart, her manicured nails ripping through the damp, rotting cardboard. She frantically threw old architectural sketches, broken drafting pencils, and ruined design magazines across the cold concrete floor. She was desperately searching for the thick, black leather journals containing the original, handwritten mathematical formulas for the Vanguard spire. If the mysterious European investor found those highly specific journals, Julian would have the absolute legal proof required to send his beautiful wife to a federal penitentiary for massive corporate fraud. "You are tearing apart the wrong graveyard, Elena," a cold, chillingly familiar voice echoed softly from the darkest corner of the freezing basement. Elena froze completely, the heavy cardboard box slipping from her numb fingers and crashing loudly onto the flooded floor. The blinding beam of the phone flashlight slowly rolled across the ruined mattress, illuminating the elegant figure sitting calmly on the single wooden chair. The woman wore a sharply tailored, pristine white cashmere coat that looked terrifyingly out of place in the rotting, industrial dungeon. She possessed the exact same high cheekbones, the same piercing eyes, and the same flawless jawline as the terrified billionaire bride. But as the mysterious investor slowly stood up, she deliberately dropped the thick, authoritative European accent she had used to completely captivate Julian and the Vanguard board of directors. "Victoria Croft does not exist," the woman stated softly, her true voice carrying a soft, slightly raspy edge that instantly made Elena's blood run absolutely cold. "She is just an expensive, beautiful illusion built by a very powerful man to destroy a pathetic monster." Elena backed away slowly, her wide, horrified eyes silently begging the universe to wake her up from this impossible, suffocating nightmare. The mind-shattering reality violently fractured her fragile sanity. The woman standing in the damp shadows was not a corporate spy, and she was certainly not a random, identical stranger. "Clara?" Elena whispered frantically, her voice choking on a massive, jagged lump of pure terror. "That is completely impossible. You are a hideous, scarred ghost. I threw you out into the freezing snow. You have absolutely nothing." "I had nothing but the agonizing truth, sister," Clara replied smoothly, stepping gracefully into the harsh circle of light. "You arrogantly assumed your stolen billions made you completely untouchable. You forgot that a mother who has her only child ripped away from her will gladly burn the entire world to ash. I spent an entire winter letting an elite team of surgeons violently shatter my jaw and rebuild my face to perfectly mirror the woman who ruined my life. I did not just want to expose your pathetic lies, Elena. I wanted to completely steal your entire existence, just like you stole mine. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of the vengeance finally crushed Elena's spirit. She fell heavily onto her bruised knees, the filthy basement water soaking completely through her expensive silk pants. The ultimate irony was brutally poetic and completely inescapable. For a decade, Elena had ruthlessly locked her brilliant younger sister in this exact freezing cage, stealing her brilliant mind to build a glamorous, fake throne in the sky. Now, the scarred ghost had returned in a flawless, identical body to legally and emotionally evict the fraudulent queen from her own castle. You took Julian from me. Elena sobbed pathetically, wrapping her trembling arms around her chest. You took my husband, my company, my reputation, and my beautiful home. Julian was never yours to begin with. You empty shell, Clara countered ruthlessly, staring down at the broken, sobbing woman with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He fell in love with the brilliant architectural mind that designed his massive legacy. He fell in love with my intellect, wrapped in your stolen face. When I return to the estate tonight, I am going to give him the encrypted flash drive containing the absolute proof of your decade of fraud. By tomorrow morning, the Vanguard Corporation will completely erase your name from history, and the state prosecutors will issue a warrant for your immediate arrest. Driven by a sudden, violent surge of desperate madness, Elena screamed and lunged forward, her manicured hands outstretched to strangle the flawless ghost. But she was severely weakened by days of starving paranoia and emotional exhaustion. Clara effortlessly stepped aside, letting her older sister crash violently onto the hard, unforgiving concrete floor. Clara calmly picked up the glowing phone from the ruined mattress, turning off the flashlight and plunging the damp, freezing basement into absolute, terrifying darkness. Enjoy the shadows, assistant, Clara whispered, her cold voice floating ominously through the pitch-black room. You have a decade of agonizing catching up to do. The heavy iron door slammed shut with a sickening, definitive crash. The rusty deadbolt slid heavily into place from the outside, echoing loudly like the final nail driving into a heavy wooden coffin. Elena screamed blindly into the suffocating darkness, beating her bloody fists against the immovable metal. Clara slowly walked up the cracked concrete stairs, stepping out into the freezing Chicago rain. A heavily armored town car was waiting patiently at the curb. She slipped into the warm, heated leather interior, instructing the silent driver to return her to the massive billionaire estate. The pathetic, useless sister was finally buried in the dark, and the true architect was going home to claim her absolute kingdom. The freezing dawn broke over the industrial outskirts of Chicago, bringing absolutely no warmth to the ruined billionaire bride. The heavy iron door of the basement suddenly swung open, but it was not her arrogant sister returning to gloat. Blinding tactical flashlights pierced the suffocating darkness, wielded by grim, heavily armed federal agents. Elena shrieked in absolute terror, shielding her swollen, tear-stained eyes as cold steel handcuffs were violently snapped around her trembling, manicured wrists. The lead investigator loudly read the massive list of federal charges, including aggravated corporate fraud, grand larceny, and severe psychological abuse. She was dragged ruthlessly up the cracked concrete stairs, her ruined silk clothing clinging to her shivering, bruised frame. A massive sea of aggressive corporate paparazzi swarmed the damp alleyway, their camera flashes exploding like continuous lightning strikes against the brick walls. They eagerly captured the spectacular, humiliating downfall of the famous Vanguard Queen. There was no elegant town car waiting for her this time, only the sterile, unforgiving metal bench of a dark police transport van. The highly encrypted flash drive had already done its lethal, surgical work overnight. High above the chaotic city streets, Clara stood silently by the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vanguard penthouse. She slowly sipped a warm cup of dark coffee, watching the morning news cycle completely devour her older sister on the massive television screen. Julian sat heavily at the dark mahogany dining table, his handsome face pale and utterly devastated. He was staring blankly at the glowing screen of his laptop, scrolling endlessly through thousands of original, undeniable basement blueprints bearing the fractured triangle watermark. He had built his entire massive real estate legacy on a foundation of breathtaking, pathetic lies. Clara did not feel a single ounce of pity for the broken billionaire. He had been so easily blinded by a pretty face and hollow marketing jargon, completely ignoring the dark, rotting cruelty hiding right beneath the surface of his own fake marriage. When Julian finally looked up, his eyes were hollow and defeated, quietly asking the mysterious woman who she truly was. Clara simply offered a cold, absolute smile, refusing to grant him the comforting closure of the truth. She was the ghost who had finally collected her long-overdue debts. With the irrefutable evidence safely in the hands of the state prosecutors, Marcus Thorne smoothly executed the final devastating stage of their ruthless corporate takeover. The Vanguard Corporation was completely dissolved by the frightened board of directors, and its massive, lucrative assets were aggressively absorbed into Clara's new, untouchable global firm. The fraudulent empire was officially dead. Deep inside the grim, concrete walls of the Federal Detention Center, Elena sat completely alone on a thin, uncomfortable mattress. Her flawless, expensive cosmetic fillers were already beginning to painfully dissolve, leaving her face looking hollow and prematurely aged. She wore a bright orange jumpsuit that scratched aggressively against her sensitive skin, her delicate hands trembling as she stared at the heavy iron bars of her tiny cell. The other aggressive inmates relentlessly mocked the former billionaire bride, completely stripping away whatever pathetic shreds of dignity she still possessed. Elena was officially trapped in a tiny, miserable box, with absolutely no windows, surrounded by suffocating noise and constant, terrifying threats. It was the exact, inescapable nightmare she had happily forced upon her innocent sister for an entire decade. The ruthless, undeniable scales of universal karma had finally balanced themselves with terrifying, poetic precision. Every time Elena closed her tired eyes, she only saw the glowing, red symbol of the fractured triangle mocking her from the darkness. 3 weeks later, the brutal, biting winds of the American Midwest were permanently replaced by the crisp, pristine air of the Swiss Alps. Clara stood on the manicured, snow-covered grounds of an elite private boarding school, her chest tight with a fierce, terrifying hope. She wore a thick cashmere coat, her breathtaking, surgically altered face flushed slightly from the high mountain altitude. She had spent the last 20 days legally securing her absolute financial independence and burying the terrifying ghost of her past existence. The heavy oak doors of the Grand Academy finally opened, and a small, familiar figure stepped out onto the sunlit stone patio. Lily wore a neat navy uniform, her bright eyes scanning the quiet courtyard before locking onto the beautiful, unfamiliar woman standing near the icy fountain. Despite the entirely new, flawless face and the expensive European clothing, the profound, unbreakable biological tether between a devastated mother and her resilient child instantly transcended the physical illusion. Lily dropped her heavy schoolbooks, running frantically across the frozen grass and throwing her small arms tightly around Clara's waist. Clara sank to her knees, burying her scarred soul in her daughter's warm hair, crying tears of absolute, unfiltered joy. The agonizing winter of her endless suffering was permanently over, melted away by the blinding warmth of their quiet reunion. True justice is rarely a swift or elegant force delivered by the hands of fate. It is often a dark, grueling architecture built from the shattered remnants of profound betrayal and suffocating pain. Society frequently demands that the victims of terrible cruelty remain silent and noble, passively waiting for an imaginary moral universe to magically balance the scales. But passive morality does not protect the innocent from those who happily feast upon their bones. Sometimes, surviving a monster requires you to step into the absolute darkness and forge your own brutal sword. However, the ultimate triumph of revenge is not found in the total destruction of the enemy, nor in the loud applause of the watching crowd. True victory is the quiet, sacred ability to finally walk away from the ashes, holding the hands of those you love, and choosing to build a beautiful new world where the shadows can never reach you again.